to announce our upcoming genealogy workshop, which will be on Monday, December 8th, and it will be titled Genealogy 101. This is where you can learn the basics of genealogy work and be able to talk with archivists and answer questions that you might have and get you started on how you would like to do your genealogical research. You can find a link up on our Facebook page and our website to sign up for this genealogy workshop. And again, that's going to be on December 8th at 9 a.m. Our 2025 Food for Thought series will continue next month as Lynn Oldshoe will present Stories Matter, Our Southern Souls. And this will be on Thursday, December 18th at noon here in the Farley Auditorium and online. And also as a quick note, our genealogy workshop is only in person. So that's an in-person event only. Food for Thought is sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives and made possible through a grant from the Alabama Humanities Alliance. Thank you to both of those organizations for making programming possible here at the Archives. Now on to today's speaker. I am happy to welcome Dr. Stephen Peach, who is an associate professor of U.S. history at Tarleton State University, which is part of the Texas A&M University System. He earned a Ph.D. in history from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a master's and bachelor's degrees from Northern Illinois University. His first book, Rivers of Power, Creek Political Culture in the Native South, is available for purchase out in the lobby if you're interested, and I'm sure you could get it signed by Dr. Peach if you would like after the program. And that's going to be the basis for his talk today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Peach.
All right, let me see if this microphone is working. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Alex, and thank you for inviting me to speak about my book. That was more than a year ago. I can't believe the day has already arrived. When she first contacted me, I leapt at the opportunity to speak about my research that I'd been working on for many years. The book came out about a year ago, and I'm here to really kind of share with you the highlights centered around Muscogee Creeks, but also the Southeastern Indians more broadly, and especially how we can think about Native American history in terms of Southern history and a larger narrative of American history. But for the most part, I will be talking about the Muscogee Creeks today. So one thing to note about language, and that is that for most of the time that I've been studying the Muscogee Creeks, I've used the term creek. I've kind of borrowed a colonizer term. This comes from the British Empire, which found Creek peoples living along the river valleys of central Georgia in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And the British realized that the Creeks liked to live along watercourses. And so this is how they got their name from European empires. But there's a movement in my field to use descendant communities' terms for their own ancestors, and Muscogee is the preferred term among modern day Creek peoples. So in this talk, I'll be moving kind of back and forth between Muscogees and Creeks, just for variety's sake. Okay. So the first point I want to make today with regard to my book and the history of Native North America writ large is that it used to be a common assumption that Native peoples, certainly when Europeans encountered them in the colonial period, were primitive, ignorant, and non-political, meaning that any sort of political structures that Native people recognized, Europeans did not. And European writers, by and large, tended to assume that their own conception of politics, particularly the nation state, was far superior to any kind of political ideology or government practice that Native people had engineered in the years before and after contact with European. Now, with regard to the Muscogee Creeks, there's actually a lot of good scholarship going back to the 1960s and 1970s, in which historians did in fact recognize that the Muscogee Creeks, like their Cherokee neighbors, their Choctaw neighbors, their Chickasaw neighbors, did in fact have very developed political traditions. But for the most part, you might say that the historical scholarship for many, many years sort of ignored native political practices intended to adopt the points of view of European colonists. And yet overall, in the last 25 years, historians have corrected a lot of these assumptions, these misperceptions about Native people, and have pointed to very advanced and complex political structures across Native North America, from the colonial period into the 19th century. So whether we're talking about the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee peoples of New York, they formed a confederation of different nations. Or whether we're talking about the Comanches and Kiowas of the Southwest, some historians argue that those groups formed a kind of empire, an indigenous empire, in which they controlled and managed land and horses and peoples. There's recent scholarship that has looked at the Shawnee Indians of the Ohio Valley, and some historians argue that the Shawnees used mobility or movement across space as a way to engineer a political system and remain flexible in the face of European colonization. So then what about the Muscogee Creeks? What of them and their Native American neighbors? Well, we know that they practiced a rich tradition of consensus. This was a political process that involved the town leader, or the Miko, along with his counselors, his head warriors, and other important persons living within a given Muscogee town. And through this process, these important leaders would debate matters both domestic and foreign. And they would often do so in the central square ground of the town in which they lived. All of these men would sit in kind of elevated positions in like brush arbor cabins according to rank and status. Sometimes there would be dignitaries, guests from other towns, other Native communities. Europeans and American officials sat in these brush arbor cabins and participated in this process of consensus. But this involved important leaders talking for hours, even days, until some sort of agreement was reached. So it's a community-driven political practice that involved all different kinds of people. And yet the primary sources are pretty clear that women and children tended to be barred from these essentially male-centered conversations. And yet consensual rule marked a departure from the more kind of top-down coercive leadership common among Europeans and later the Americans. One thing that I often notice from studying the records among the Muscogee peoples is that these leaders, Mikos, their counselors, and other allies were notoriously divisive. I mean, it would take them a long time to reach some sort of agreement on whether they wanted to go to war against a white community or another Native community, about whether they wanted to engage in trading relationships with the Spanish versus the French Empire. So division was really kind of the order of the day, but consensus would be a way to bring that town community together and offer a sense of coherence. We also know about a parallel tradition of localism, in which leaders and other political decision makers would involve the town community as well as clans, which were kinship systems. And during these moments of decision making, townspeople might sit outside of the square ground. This is where you might find women and children kind of subtly shaping the decisions that men were making in the square ground. Sometimes women in particular, who acted as clan leaders, might urge their male relatives to go to war against someone, and sometimes they might urge peace. But no matter the outcome of these discussions, localism involved the entire town community and offered approval or disapproval of how headmen or political leaders decided to act. Unfortunately for the Muskogees and other native Southerners, European and American colonization put extraordinary pressure on existing native political systems, particularly the process of consensus and localism. Empires like the Spanish, the French, and the British introduced new manufactured goods. They brought with them new pathogens or diseases. They brought new ideas about religion. And most important, European empires, as well as the US Republic, craved land and resources for expansion west. So how Native peoples, such as the Muscogees, responded to these forces, politically speaking, is a major source of scholarly debate. And I'll just pose the question here. How did Native Americans in the colonial period and even into the early 19th century respond to these new colonial pressures? There are many books and articles and other writings about this exact question, mine being one of the most recent. In fact, there are all kinds of books about the Muscogees alone that attempt to answer this question. How did the political structures of the Muscogees adapt and respond to European empires and the rise of the US Republic? Well, some scholars argue for the ongoing relevance of local institutions, such as the clan and the town. There is one book devoted just to one particular town, the town of Okfuskee, which is now underwater up in the area around Lake Martin. Other historians assert that the Muscogees turned to the European concept of nationhood and decided to chart a nation in the Revolutionary period. This is most affiliated with the mixed Scotch Creek headman named Alexander MacGillivray, who charted a path of nationhood during the American Revolutionary War. But my book, on the other hand, kind of creates a middle path between the local and national dimensions of the Muscogee Creek government. Kinship and town life remained vital, sure, and headmen did speak about a nation from time to time, certainly in their interactions with European observers. But in the course of my research, I kept encountering political leaders who underscored the 4 provinces that made up Creek country. Each province or sub-regional unit within Creek country encompassed those towns and clans that I mentioned before. And these provinces provided a political blueprint for coordination and action across different communities in Creek country. I even talk about provincial leaders, such as Birdtail King of Cusita there, who worked with leaders from other provinces in Creek country to combat American expansion during and after the American Revolutionary War. So this is how I frame my book then, around the provincial makeup of the Muscogee government. Furthermore, these same political leaders compared the provinces to rivers, and they did it a lot. This is what I think makes my book unique, at least according to my reviewers, those who have read it and published those reviews. Headmen, political leaders, interpreted and explained political action with a consistent reference to rivers, such as the Chattahoochee, the Tallapoosa, the Coosa, and Alabama. And this makes perfect sense. To the Muscogees, rivers provided a source of life for crops, for corn, beans, squash, wheat, and other cultigens that Native women grew for their families. Rivers provided a source of clean water, especially for bathing. They provided a source of water and life for animals that men hunted, particularly white-tailed deer. And rivers even were a place of spiritual power. The Muscogees believed that the great tie snake or serpent resided in the waters of creeks around Creek country. So to me, riverine provinces, if we can call them this, offer us a window into an indigenous conception of government, a Muscogee conception of government, an indigenous conception of leadership and political power. Leaders partnered within and across these 4 quadrants of Creek country to do a number of things, to secure trade goods from European empires, to wage wars against enemies and make peace with those same enemies. And they also united across the provinces when they could to defend land from European colonists and ultimately US citizens. So then whatever momentum there was for nation building among the Muscogees tended to be eclipsed by the promotion of provinces and the clans and towns that formed the backbone of those provinces. I don't really see a Muscogee nation then. I see rivers of power. And this, of course, is not to deny, I should add, the fact that modern-day Muscogees live in a nation today in Oklahoma, one with official recognition by the federal government. They have their own tribal government, their own healthcare system, their own police force, their own schools. But my book does trace the Muscogees' decision to reject nationhood in the early years of the United States and to float a more traditional construction of indigenous government. So that's kind of the first major argument of my book. But to help you visualize these provinces, I do want to show you a really good map, which graces the book cover of my book. It's a map from 1748 by Emmanuel Bowen. He was the cartographer or the map maker for the British Empire in the middle of the 18th century. What's striking to me is that Europeans noticed the provincial dimensions of the Muscogee world. So I have these 4 provinces highlighted by different colors. First, of course, the Lower Creeks here in turquoise. The Lower Creek province inhabited the area along the Chattahoochee River and Flint River. Some of the major towns were Coweta and Cusseta. Bowen, like other map makers, did sometimes incorrectly place a town on their map. So Coweta, according to archaeological excavations later on, was actually located on the west side of the Chattahoochee River, opposite Columbus, Georgia. Coweta was a very important town in the Lower Creek province, and sometimes the records refer to the Lower Creeks as the Cowetas. Secondly, the Middle Creeks, highlighted right here, lived along the middle and upper reaches of the Tallapoosa River, primarily. And they were often called, therefore, Tallapoosas in the primary sources. Some of the major towns within the Tallapoosa province were Tuckabashie and Tallahassee, which are essentially correctly placed on this map. I believe the modern-day town of Tallahassee in Alabama resides on top of the old town of Tallahassee there in the 18th century, and then Tuckabashie resided just across river. Those were 2 important towns here in the Middle Creek province. Thirdly, you have the Alabamas that I have highlighted in red. They lived along the upper reaches of the Alabama River and the lower Coosa River, so right around here. Some towns of note were Coushatta, for instance, and Tuskegee. And then finally, there is the Upper Creek province, depicted up here on the upper reaches of the Coosa River. But you could also find upper creeks along the Tallapoosa River as well, intermixed among the Tallapoosa or middle towns. Important towns among the upper creeks were Coosa and Abacucci. And sometimes the Upper Creek province is called the Coosa province. And another name that European observers heard when they were talking to members of the Upper Creek province were Abicas, the Abicas. And to make matters a little bit more politically confusing and complex, over time, the Middle Creeks, the Alabamas, and the Upper Creeks became collectively known as the Upper Creeks, and often associated that way in councils with other Native people, with Europeans, and with the United States. But those are the 4 distinct quadrants of Muscogee Creek country. And much of my book focuses primarily on the Upper Creeks or Abicas and the Middle Creeks or Tallapoosas. And it kind of brings in the Lower Creeks and Alabamas as the sources kind of dictate to me. But it is very much a provincial story to help us see through a European concept of nationhood, but one that also recognized local communities in Muscogee country. Now, the Muscogees were surrounded by European empires. So in 1748, you have the Spanish down here in Florida, the French out here in the colony of Louisiana, and then the British Empire and the Carolinas and Georgia. The Muscogees traded deer skins for manufactured goods with all three of these empires at different times and different places. Some towns were more committed to trade with the French. Other towns were more committed to trade with the British. And then there were also native groups living around Muscogee country. So the Cherokees inhabited the Smoky Mountains over here, kind of western North Carolina, northern Georgia. The Chickasaws in the northern portion of what is today Mississippi, Choctaws down here, southern Mississippi, as well as some Yamasee groups and other mission Indians that were connected very tenuously to the Spanish Empire, which had launched conversion efforts going back to the 1600s. So there were a lot of different groups interacting with the Muscogees in the Southeast, an incredibly diverse place, politically speaking, linguistically speaking, ethnically speaking. And my book just kind of narrows into one particular group, the Muscogees. So the second point I want to say here, drawing on my book, is that a lot of what I'm doing is conducting a kind of social and cultural history, meaning I'm focused at the ground level. What are communities doing? What are local peoples doing to inform political leaders who are making decisions at the provincial level? And another way of saying this is that I'm doing Native history from the ground up, or from the community up. So to tell the history of the Muscogee provinces, I need to discuss clans and towns in a little bit more depth. Against this top-down focus on leadership comes clans, for example. So these were kinship systems that structured Creek's relations with one another. It gave you a sense of place, an anchor in your world. These clans were matrilineal, which meant that every Creek boy and girl took on the clan identity of their mother. That identity was symbolized by a clan totem, such as wind, or bear, or deer, or tiger. You were related to your mother, to your own siblings, of course, your brothers and sisters. You were related to her mother, or your maternal grandmother. And finally, you were related to her siblings, meaning your aunts and uncles, maternal aunts and uncles. The mother and her sisters would raise the daughter, teaching her how to farm, but also gather wild roots and berries, whereas the boys would be raised by the mother's brother, who would refer to him as sister's son. So the uncles raised their nephews in a matrilineal society. The biological father played very little role in the upbringing of his children because he was busy being an uncle to his sister's own children in a different clan. And this is another point I should make here, is that clans did not marry within, they married without. So a member of the Bear clan would marry a member of the Tiger clan. This is how the Creeks would prohibit any situations of incest. Women altogether guarded clan interests and supplied members with food by farming crops. Towns, too, provided additional cultural and social meaning. The town was the chief social unit of Muscogee organization. Headmen and their counselors met in the square ground, as I mentioned before, to discuss important business. But towns also hosted various ceremonies, such as the annual green corn ceremony, involving all members of the community. So as the corn crop would ripen in July and August, that particular town would unite. All the clans living within that town would come together as a member of that particular polity, and they would give thanks to the Master of Breath and to forgive past transgressions. Towns were also important because they hosted social and political events, such as the bestowal of war titles on young, talented warriors who had taken life in battle, And those war titles would be used politically to allow men to climb the political ladder and earn political status within their community. In the arena of high politics, women did not hold formal office, but they did exercise political influence. There is evidence that women, sometimes in union with their children, called on male relatives to form war parties and avenge the killing of loved ones within their own clan. This is known as the custom of clan retaliation. At the same time, when wars proved too long or destructive, women did shape headmen's decisions to make peace overtures with that enemy. And this is usually inferred from the primary sources with quotes like the women and children belonging to the group of this particular leader, or the women of that town spoke in this way. European and American observers often caught these sayings from Muscogee peoples. Women and children, they're there. They have some kind of impact. We know this. Creek women even provided military intelligence to political leaders like Big Warrior. If you take a look at that caption there, based on this record from 1813, during the Creek Civil War, many Creek women served as spies, for example, to assist the Creeks in preventing any kind of invasion from the U.S. military. So again, women exercise political influence, if not political power. Warriors, too, made their impact felt. One way to climb up that social political ladder was to take the life of an enemy, return home unharmed, and hopefully earn a war title. Thus, we see young Muscogees raiding other Native peoples and white settler communities in order to derive war honors. This is depicted in this particular hieroglyphic or a pictograph from during the Creek Choctaw War, in which 6 Creek warriors fire on 4 Choctaws, take their scalps, and then row home. This demonstrated the mastery of these warriors, but also of the deer or stag clan, which you can see drawn over these warriors. So there's a kinship element as well in taking life. Moreover, when Muscogee and U.S. leaders were seeking peace in the 1780s and 1790s, warriors often smashed these agreements and war would erupt on the southern frontier. And American officials often complained that the headmen couldn't keep track of their young men. They couldn't rein them in. Thirdly, historians have also begun to map out the intricate and shifting relationship between indigenous societies. Native people worried about European and U.S. settlers, clearly, but this is more than an Indian white story. I suggest that Muscogee leaders expended more political energy on fellow indigenous people. Much of my book, in fact, revolves around the Muscogees' 3 major antagonists in the region: the Cherokees, the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws. Wars with these societies resulted from many factors, but particularly access to hunting grounds. But much of the violence was driven by, number 1, those warriors who I mentioned before, seeking war accolades, seeking access to political power. And 2, much of these wars were generated by calls for vengeance or clan retaliation, which again involved women and to some degree children. Indeed, I argue that the Muscogees' principal enemies were other indigenous people, but they were also the principal allies of the Muscogees. For example, headmen from the Abika and Tallapoosa provinces worked closely to make peace with the Choctaws in the years shortly before the American Revolutionary War, often sending messages and tokens of peace, including white feathers. White, according to Native Southerners, communicated peace and friendship. Years later, in the 1790s, the Muscogees fell into war with the Chickasaws, who were armed by American officials, actually, and who consistently bested Muscogee warriors on the battlefield. And that Chickasaw-American alliance undermined a lot of Muscogee unity at this point. But thankfully, one important leader named Mad Dog, he belonged to Tuckabachi within the Tallapoosa province, helped to end this war by pointing out that Native peoples must unite across tribal lines. Otherwise, to him and other leaders, the U.S. might easily overwhelm Native inhabitants in the region and acquire their land. Indeed, Mad Dog and other leaders such as Singer talked about the four mothers with a reference to the four major Native populations in the South. And it was hoped that the four mothers might roll back U.S. expansion. And it seems to have been the case that these leaders used the term mother very strategically to kind of involve women in the political process and acknowledge that women were the ones who worked the land. Indeed, Singer, who belonged to the Alabamas, and particularly the town of Hickory Ground, worked hard to unite the four mothers around a pact in which Native peoples agreed to give up no more land, to cede no more land to the United States by the early 1800s. This society, by the way, the Four Mothers, reemerged years later following removal to Oklahoma when the Southeastern Indians again tried to stop more rounds of settler intrusions before Oklahoma would become a state in 1907. Yet the problem of trade debt disrupted pan-Indian unity. By 1800, really all Native peoples across the Southeast were dependent on the United States, as well as a merchant house operating out of Spanish Florida for manufactured goods. And as a result, they had been buying a lot of trade goods on credit, and they find themselves in debt. And sometimes there weren't enough white-tailed deer and other animals to hunt and to use those skins as a form of currency to pay off their debts. So what do Native people do? Well, the British Empire and the US proposed using land as a way to pay off debts. In fact, the United States inherited this practice from the British Empire. Land cessions, often codified by treaty, resulted in dwindling Native domains. And Singer and Mad Dog and other Muscogee leaders were right there signing these land cession treaties and ultimately setting the stage for Indian removal by the 1830s. All right, so I've probably shared a little bit too much from my book, but I do welcome questions. I do want to take a few minutes to conclude, go over these highlights again in a slightly different way. But I do want to mention that the insights that I'm sharing from my book, as well as the work of other historians, does help us to see that the American South in the 18th and early 19th centuries was a very complicated place. Sure, the region's geopolitics revolved around European empires and the US Republic, but numerous Native populations, such as those four Muscogee provinces, were important as well. Intertribal warfare, intertribal diplomacy temporarily halted settler expansion. And that demonstrates to us that Native people very much were calling the shots, at least until the early 19th century. Nationhood is an important category as well, primarily because Native polities today embrace it in their formal relationship with the US government. But before the modern era, Native peoples practiced an array of political forms, whether it's the provincial mode of governance that I've been talking about today, or the kind of Confederate form of governance practiced by the Haudenosaunee in New York, or a more imperial mode of governance practiced by the Comanches and Kiowas in the Southwest. These all offer us alternatives to the European concept of nationhood. And finally, the historical record should be mentioned. The older assumption among historians was that there are too few documents to unearth Native history, yet this is so patently false. I realized this quickly when I was a grad student researching the Creeks. There are thousands of pages of records dedicated to the Muskogees alone, let alone other Native populations in the Southeast. And that's because you have three European empires and then the United States all interacting with the Muskogees over many, many years. And this left a long paper trail for historians to study. And it allows us to see what Native people were doing and what they were thinking. In fact, much of my book relies on the speeches of political leaders like Mad Dog or Singer, who candidly shared their ideas about colonialism, war, and government. All right, that's it, folks. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. And if you're watching us online, you can put your questions in the comments and I'll ask them on your behalf. If we need some time in here to think through questions, I actually do have a question from online.
Oh, okay.
Did the Muscogee regard rivers as territorial boundaries between different groups? For instance, was the area west of the Upper Creek Cahaba River a buffer from the Choctaw or something else?
So I have a distinct archival source from the 1750s. It's from a British agent to the Southeastern Indians who very clearly learned from the Creeks and Choctaws who had met with that rivers were not to be boundaries. Instead, they're to be these shared spaces along which people, goods, ideas, and other things moved. So rivers, at least from the conception of Muscogee peoples, but also other native peoples, were supposed to be a bridge, in fact, uniting different groups of people. And even within a particular province, like say along the Tallapoosa River, on one side you have the town of Tallahassee, the other side you have the town of Tuckabashie. Just because there's a river there doesn't mean those people didn't meet. They're friendly with each other. Their kinsmen are living within both of those towns. So that's kind of another way in which rivers were actually meant to bring people together and encourage unity. So, yeah.
I know your work is mainly focused on Creek political culture, but did you find that this either values of rivers or how rivers played into the other three mother nations, was this unique to the Creek space, or did these other ones also have a very similar language around that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always assumed that rivers held some sort of cultural and spiritual importance for other Southeastern Indian groups, but I haven't seen too much of that in the primary sources. What I have noticed is that all of these major native populations in the Southeast did divide their country or their society into different divisions, provinces, sub-regional units, whatever we want to call those. Among the Cherokees, there's the upper towns, there's the valley towns, there's the overhill towns, meaning over the Smoky Mountains. So those divisions were still important, those provincial divisions, if we want to call them that. You do see that among the Choctaws as well. I don't remember the exact number. I think there were at least 3 major provincial divisions among the Choctaws, and they had their own kind of provincial leaders who nonetheless hailed from a particular clan and town. I assume that rivers and water in general were important to the other members here of these groups, but certainly that provincial element, it's there, and more historians are talking about it. There is a book from Tyler Bulware. Let's see, he published that, I don't know, a little bit after 2010, and he deconstructs the Cherokee Nation, in which he talks about these different provinces, which kind of feeds into what I'm saying here. I'm sort of doing a Muscogee version of what he did for the Cherokees. So. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, are you familiar with the Porch Band of Creek Indians in this area, Montgomery, Wetumpka, Atmore?
Not enough. I do know that they're around and that they have federal recognition,
Yeah.
but I don't know too much.
Would that be like a clan or a province, or any idea about that?
I mean, as far as I know, the descendants of the Porch Band were people who had lost during the Creek Civil War, who were defeated by the Creeks, who were friendly to the federal government along with the federal government itself. And so they just kind of hived off and formed their own community moving south in the Tensas River Valley. And I think a lot of those people, not all of them, did belong to the Alabama province. And they practiced their own particular customs. Many of them were commercial farmers. They practiced African chattel slavery. So slightly different group from the other divisions in Creek country.
You have come up with a lot of detail in your research. And the only evidence that I've seen so far on the screen is letters written by Europeans in English.
Yeah.
physical evidence or native records do you find? Is there a preponderance of that, or is that just something you get from going out in the field?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the vast majority of the primary sources that I rely on and most other historians of the American South rely on to study these Native people come from the writings of wealthy European men, along with wealthy American men. So I'm actually looking at their observations of Native groups, and I kind of extrapolate from that. However, I mentioned the speeches at the end of my talk. Both Europeans and Americans minutely recorded the words that Creek leaders were saying. And those were usually translated from Muscogee into English, or maybe Muscogee into Spanish into English. But what I noticed from numerous speeches that I have access to is that these are essentially indigenous sources. Sure, the pen, the writing does come from whites, but it's the concepts, the names, the details that Native leaders provide that gave me insight into these different provinces. And they're using terms like Abicas or Talapusas or Alabamas. They're not saying nation too much. They're not even saying Creek or Muscogee too much. They're referring specifically to those indigenous names for provinces as well as towns and clans. So I consider the political speeches of Native leaders to be very much Native sources, even if the writing itself comes from the hand of white men. I hope that makes sense. And that's an issue that really all historians face in studying Native history. It's the problematic written record, but we can find evidence, little nuggets of indigenous ideas, indigenous things that we can then interpret.
Yeah, my generation grew up with a white man's version of history.
Sure.
And since I've retired, I've had time to really look into it. And I'd like to sue my college for putting me in an auditorium with 500 students, one professor, because it ruined my appreciation of history at the time. I just love it now, especially the Indian history and the atrocities of what we did to these people, because they were not savages. We turned them into savages to fight for their lands. We were taking them away. We didn't settle the wilderness. The Indians knew where to go.
Right, exactly.
There wasn't a wilderness to them. So it's such a different version of history I have now than the last 70 years of my life.
It is, yeah.
And the American Revolution is on with Ken Burns now.
Yes, I heard about that.
Great series about the Revolution. I'm going to buy your book, by the way.
Thanks.
This book by Ned Blackhawk,
Yeah.
The Rediscovery of America, is just amazing.
I finished that recently. It's a very good synthesis, if you will, of like Native North America. He covers a lot of ground.
You have history from the Indian tribe standpoint. So very, very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your kind comment.
I wonder about the relationships among the four provinces. Were there mechanisms through which the provinces could debate things and reach agreement that would cover the Muscogee world, or did they each go their own way?
Yeah, there were a couple of mechanisms in place. The first one being language. Most of the peoples living within the Muscogee Creek country spoke dialects of the Muscogean language family, and most, in fact, spoke Muscogee proper. The Alabama language is a little bit different, but it still belongs to the Muscogee language family, so they could communicate that way. Secondly, kinship was certainly a way to bring different towns and therefore provinces together, just based on marital relations. The practice of intermarriage across clans is known as exogamy. And as a result, you have multiple peoples within two or more clans meeting to discuss common agendas. We do know this from the records. But perhaps most importantly, there were certain towns within Creek country where these grand councils would meet. Tuckabatchee among the Middle Creeks was one of them, and Creek leaders would come from far and wide to meet at Tocobachi and discuss important matters. This is where you'll find like European observers actually joining the conversation and trying to kind of influence Creeks to accept a land cession, for example. Coweta, among the lower Creeks, was another major area for council governance among the 4 provinces within Creek country. And there's plenty of evidence in the records to suggest that these would become basically seats of the Creek Nation. And in fact, European and American officials would refer to these areas as councils of the Creek Nation. I'm pushing back against that a little bit because I do think that sort of imposes a European construct onto Muscogee peoples, as I've been presenting here today, but you might to some degree think about those as national meetings or just really interprovincial meetings. Yeah. So there were all kinds of political, kinship-driven and cultural mechanisms that brought these people together so they could discuss a common agenda. Yeah, it's an excellent question.
How similar were the languages among the 4 groups? Were they close at all?
Very, very close, yes. Alabama is a little bit more of an outlier. The town of Yuchi among the lower Creeks spoke the Yuchi language, and that, as far as I know from anthropologists, is like a language isolate. It didn't really have any relationship to the other Muscogean languages. But even then, you'd have people who would be living in nearby towns who might translate for the Yuchis so they could interact with other Muscogee Creeks. Yeah. So the Muscogees belong to the eastern grouping of the Muscogean language family, whereas like the Choctaws and Chickasaws belong to the western grouping of the Muscogean language family. And even then, the Choctaws could pretty easily communicate with people from like the Tallapoosa province. But you might have some sort of translator, an indigenous translator, who might kind of work through those issues.
Just curious, what was the population of Muscogee?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So around 1750, I want to say the population was approaching 50,000 people from a low of maybe 30,000 in the early 18th century as a result of warfare among different native groups and the practice of Indian slavery, which I haven't mentioned. But overall, throughout the 18th century, the population of the Muscogees actually rebounded. It increased. By the early years of the 1800s. So yeah, about 50,000. Yeah, maybe a little under. Yeah.
With the society based somewhat along the concept of rivers, environmentally, history-wise, floods, droughts, did those cause major disruptions, or were those transformative effects on the culture?
In the 18th century, I don't think so. At least I didn't see them in the records. A lot of these Muscogee peoples here in the Southeast were descendants of the Mississippian chiefdoms, especially in areas like Moundville or Etowah in Georgia. And so they migrated south and took up residence along these rivers hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And maybe then they may have faced some kind of environmental problems with rivers flooding. But as far as I can tell, from the 18th century forward, I mean, women had been managing the land long enough that they probably knew where and when certain bends in the river would flood, and so they probably planted accordingly. There are records referring to famine, the destruction of crops throughout the 18th century, but that was usually caused by like a war, essentially, some sort of societal disruption generated by humans. Yeah.
And so just for everyone online, that was a question about floods and environmental issues and things like that. Sorry, the only reason I have the microphone so people online, it's not silence and then an answer to a question. But that was just what it was, but no problem here. Is anyone else have a question? Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Peach again.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to everybody here and everyone joining us online. I hope to see you again next month on December 18th. Thank y'all. It'd be Lynn Oldshoe presenting Stories Matter, Our Southern Souls. So she has a great blog and podcast and everything like that. So she's going to be presenting stories from around the state. Thank you.